Okay, so this is a 20-minute or so presentation about the apple tree. Today, we transition from the days of hazel into the days of apple. And apple will take us up to summer solstice, of course, and 9 days beyond. I'll come to that further on. So to begin with, I want to start trying to pay more attention to the medieval Irish law about the Ogham. So whether I'm pronouncing it right, I don't know. I'm not a Gaelic speaker, but there is this thing from the 14th century called the Briatha Ogham, and the Briatha Ogham is 3 lots of word kennings to give you information about that letter of the Ogham. Now, out of the 20 trees letters, at least 8 or 9 are definitely trees. However, according to the Briatha Ogham, not all of the 20 letters are trees. However, there's something in English called the Scholar's Primer that comes from the same manuscript source that says they are all trees. So there's a little bit of medieval debating to go through, not for today, but apple is one of those awkward ones with the Briatha Ogham. But I think apple is absolutely this time of year, and I'll justify that shortly. But here's how awkward the Briatha Ogham are. So for this letter of the alphabet, the Briatha Ogham has it as Cert, C-E-R-T in English, Cert. And so one word kenning is shelter of a lunatic. And the word lunatic is in question. So it might mean mad person or madman. It might mean social outcast or a village fool. It's not, it's just shelter of a lunatic question mark. What do you do with that? I don't know. Curiously, there is a poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen called Apple Trees. And the poem Apple Trees is about Merlin living as a madman in the Caledonian forest. Anyway, that's a very tenuous thing. So the first Briatha Ogham, shelter of a lunatic. The second one is substance of an insignificant person. Now, the reason for that possibly is that the word curt is possibly meaning bush, as in shrub, or rags. It's not clear. People don't know whether it should be bush or rags. But substance of an insignificant person could be ragged clothing. Or it could be that apples are so common that they're a food available to everybody, no matter what your social status. You know, like I went on holidays a long time ago to Tunisia, and in Tunisia, there's oranges just lying in the road because there's orange trees everywhere. They're worth nothing in Tunisia. So even the most homeless person can eat plenty of oranges in Tunisia. And I think apples were possibly similar in medieval Ireland or whatever. You know, it's such a common thing that even the poorest of poorest people could get by on apples. They're there if it's the right time of year. But substance of an insignificant person could mean rags, just as in ragged clothing. Now, the third Briatha Ogham goes along with the rags. It says, dregs of clothing is curt. So we touched on this before. The Briatha Ogham for holly was iron bar, and yet in a long way round of thinking, you can't melt iron bar without the charcoal from the holly tree. You know, so there was this relationship between holly and iron bar. But how you get from bush or rags to apple tree I haven't got a clue. Anyway, the Scholar's Primer, which comes from the same manuscript, the Book of Ballymote, 1390 AD, the Scholar's Primer says apple, quert is apple, and it's the shelter of a wild hind, a female deer, shelters under the apple tree. So you take from that whatever you want to take from it, really. You know, I'm not super convinced about the word kennings of the Briathra Ogham, and I happily go along with the tree list of the Scholar's Primer. So in the Ogham Grove, the 20 trees that we have and the sequence of those 20 trees is from the Scholar's Primer. And they, both the Briathra Ogham and the Scholar's Primer, are from the same source anyway. So it's not so much an argument, it's just more about which do you favor, you know, and most people are just using the Ogham for readings. So if you want to pull up an apple twig and consider it rags, I don't know what you do with that. However, so leaving that aside then, the apple tree in Irish lore is quite wonderful and quite brilliant. So in the Ogham Grove itself, the apple tree holds summer solstice. More than that, it's anchoring the pentagram of trees that are the rose family, you know, so that's blackthorn and hawthorn and rowan stuff, you know, that they make this rose family pentagram that perfectly interlaces with the evergreen pentagram, you know, and so the evergreen pentagram is anchored on the yew tree at winter solstice. So with the Ogham Grove, and again, the tree sequence isn't me, the tree sequence is the Scholar's Primer from 1390, but it places yew at some, you know, it puts yew at winter solstice and apple at summer solstice. So what I'm about to tell you now then, and it's only going to be a garbled version, but there is in Irish lore, Irish mythology, Irish bardic tradition, a story that is akin to Romeo and Juliet, if you like. It's two lovers that are forbidden to be together because they're from different counties of Ireland. So that the girl is a princess and her name is Eileen, or Ailinn, and she's a princess of Leinster, which is southern Ireland, roughly. And the prince, the young man, is Boya, and he's a prince of Ulster. And so because they're from two royal families, Ulster and Leinster, they're not allowed to be together, you know, like Romeo and Juliet being from two different families, but they fall in love and they meet secretly and all the rest of it. And tragically, they die. Similar to the Romeo and Juliet story is that they both drop dead thinking that the other one has died. They die of heartache for each other, you know, and so that's the tragedy of it. And it's a well-known story that people like W.B. Yeats wrote many poems about the star-crossed lovers, Eileen and Boya. Don't know how to pronounce it perfectly. It's spelled B-A-I-L-E, but it's pronounced Bolya or something like that. Anyway, the two lovers are buried, and from the boy's or the prince's grave grows a yew tree. And as it grows and becomes a bigger tree, it grows into the likeness of the young man. And from the girl's grave, an apple tree grows, you know, and it grows into the likeness of the princess. And for a long time, this yew tree and this apple tree, winter solstice and summer solstice, pentagrams interlaced, these two trees grow together, you know. Eventually, they're chopped down and the wood from each of those trees is turned into a tablet upon which the bards and druids or whatever wrote down the histories and the relationships, the love, companionships of Ulster and Leinster, the two provinces of Ireland. And so it was kept like that for a while. These sacred wooden tablets were records of marriages and love relationships. And then one day, the story goes, and I think it's quite early, it's meant to be something like 300 AD or about that sort of time. The bards from Leinster bring their tablet, and the bards of Ulster have their tablet, and they come to the same hall where there's a big royal gathering. And when the two tablets are brought into the hall, they come together and they're stuck so firmly, like they fly towards each other and they cannot be separated. And just like the yew and apple pentagrams interlocked, you know, it's the same sort of thing. And they were kept, that interlocked tablets, bardic tablets, were kept in Tara as royal treasures until the Christian era, or the Vikings raided and destroyed all the treasures of Tara, you know. But it's a story from Ireland about the perfect union or interlocking, yin and yang, yew tree and apple tree, however you want to get your head around it, you know. Knowing the Ogham Grove has these two trees as winter solstice and summer solstice, and on top of that has the interlacing pentagrams, sings to me much more than the Briatha Ogham about bush and rags and you know, hiding place of a lunatic and things like that. It just makes no sense to my brain. But there is this natural yin and yang of winter solstice and summer solstice, yew and apple tree. And again, that's just a pattern that happens naturally when you take the 20 trees from the Scholar's Primer and put them evenly divided around a circle. That's the pattern you get. So the apple tree does have a significant part in Irish mythology. That's the vague story I've just told you of the Irish Romeo and Juliet. It's worth looking up some of W.B. Yeats' poetry about Eileen and Bollia, and he talks about yew and apple in his poems. It's quite interesting. So as far as star law goes, then the days of apple, where we are now, go from the 21st degree of Gemini to the 9th degree of Cancer the Crab. The summer solstice is the cusp between Gemini and Cancer the Crab. You know, that's that moment. You can see it as the final moment of Gemini or the very first moment of Cancer. It's the cusp between the two, and 9 degrees either side, which is roughly 9 days either side of the summer solstice. Now, Gemini is governed by Mercury. We touched on Mercury quite a bit recently. It's the messenger, it's the communicator, it's the wisdom talker and stuff. And so there's the last 9 days of that, and then it's going into Cancer the Crab, and Cancer the Crab is the moon, you know, and the moon is the reflective mind, as opposed to Leo the lion, which is the sun and the all-knowing mind, you know. So the sun part of the brain just knows, but the moon part of the brain is reflecting, reflected light is reflecting on all input, if you like, contemplating. So apple carries that star law of Mercury to the moon. Make of that what you will, you know, the communication, wisdom, and the reflective mind. And that is also the end of the rising of energy. So if you looked at it in a qigong or tregung type way, you know, on an in-breath, you're breathing from you're drawing energy up your spine from between your legs as you breathe in. So it's nice deep. And it's going to finish at the top of your neck, where your neck goes into the skull, stimulates your pineal gland, and that's your summer solstice moment. You know, so the days of Apple are that moment. And the yew tree is the complete opposite. It's the everything settling back down to the very bottom of your lower cauldron, and then the 3-day standstill of winter solstice. That's your yew tree, and then back up to summer solstice again. So right now, energetically, in the year, we're at that conclusion of the in-breath, you know, and from that moment onwards, there's a depletion or a letting go of energy, you know. So Apple is this, the first 9 degrees of Apple, the first 9 days of Apple are this final rising. And then there's 3-day standstill. And then just the very, very beginning of beginning to let go and relax. And that's the Apple. Now, the winter solstice has a Celtic star law that we can look at on the Gunderstrup cauldron, which to do with the boar hunt, or the winter hunter and his hound, is the winter stars. The summer stars are known as the summer triangle, or in Welsh Brythonic law, they're the birds of Rhiannon, you know, and so that moment of in-breath when your pineal gland is stimulated and there's tingling in your brow, that's the 3 birds of Rhiannon, you know, and that's where we are in the cycle of the year. And so you could see Rhiannon then as the summer queen, or the rose queen, or the apple queen, or what have you, you know. And also Apple is the conclusion of the Aicme Uatha, of course, too. So you've had it beginning with Hawthorne, the May Queen, and then the kind of intrigue of Oak King and Holocking fighting for her interest. Then the wisdom of Hazel and people like Taliesin and Ogma, who invents the Ogham. And now it concludes, just like the first quarter concluded with, in my mind, Lugh ash tree at spring equinox. We're now concluding with the apple queen, the summer queen, summer solstice, you know, that's her conclusion. Now, this is very new age or new thought, or whatever you want to call it, but there does seem to be a pattern of placing the sacred sword amongst the apples, and I'll explain that now shortly. So if you look back on a couple of YouTube clips, I showed something called the rock birth from Hadrian's Wall, and it has a Mithras figure, and with his sword he's pointing at the space between Gemini and Cancer the crab. So you have this sword pointing to the summer solstice. And that's interesting because in Arthurian romance, there's especially a book that in English is now called The High History of the Holy Grail, Sir Gawain. And remember, Gawain is like a year-wheel knight. He does the Gawain and the Green Knight is a winter solstice thing. He does Gawain and Dame Ragnell is a Beltane thing. And in the High History of the Holy Grail, Gawain has to find, and I quote, this isn't me being racist, this is the story, he has to find the Saracen sword that decapitated John the Baptist. You know, so this is a later echo of Celtic things. It is Christianized medieval Celticism, really. And I'll go over that in a minute. But we touched on it before. In the Arthurian stories, Jesus is the winter solstice. He's celebrated after the 3-day standstill of winter solstice. And his magical grail hallows are the spear that stabbed him in the side and the cup that caught his blood. you know, so there's two treasures for the Winter King, if you like. And John the Baptist is his polarity opposite. You know, the Feast of John the Baptist is 24th of June, after the 3-day standstill after the summer solstice. And his two magical Holy Grail hallows are the sword that decapitated John the Baptist and the platter that John's head was put upon, you know. So you have sword and plate for John and spear and cup for Jesus. That's Arthurian medieval adaptations of what was already old in Gaelic stuff. You know, when you've got the sword of Nuada and the spear of Nu and the cauldron of the Dagda and so on, you've got 4 treasures, if you like, of the Duatha. So an interesting thing then, so the Hadrian's Wall rockbirth has Mithras pointing to summer solstice with a sword. And the Arthurian tradition has Gawain looking for the sword that decapitated the summer king, John the Baptist. You know? So there's this summer relationship to this sword. And even stranger, now the very first Arthurian life story of King Arthur is the History of the Kings of Britain, which isn't a history, it's a fiction, but it's called The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And Geoffrey of Monmouth is the very, very first person to say the name Avalon. Okay, it begins with Geoffrey of Monmouth. Except for that's not completely true, because the way we say Avalon today is a modern English spelling, A-V-A-L-O-N. That's not how Geoffrey of Monmouth spelt it originally. He spelt it as A-double-L-O-N-I-S. So it looks like Athalonis. That was the original 12th century spelling. And then as the centuries have gone by, Athalonis has turned into Avalon. It doesn't really matter, because both spellings mean the same thing. They mean place of apples, or the realm of apples, or the Isle of Apples, or whether. So here we are in the days of apples, you know. Now, in Geoffrey's book, Avalon gets mentioned twice. The second time is the most famous. Most people are aware of it. It's where Arthur is taken to when he's at the end of his life, when he's been mortally wounded, he's taken to Avalon, or Athalonis sort of thing. But a bit that gets overlooked, because later Arthurian stories have Excalibur being drawn from a stone and stuff. You know, that's later versions of the story. In the very first story, Geoffrey of Monmouth, the first person to mention Avalon, he describes Arthur's sword and he says it was forged in Avalon. So you've got the most magical sword coming from the place of apples. You know, quite interesting. When you go back and think of Hadrian's Wall, Mithras pointing with his sword to the summer solstice, you've got Sir Gawain looking for the sword that decapitated the summer king, and you've got Geoffrey of Monmouth saying King Arthur's magic sword was forged in Avalon, the place of apples. You know, so make of that what you will. You know, I did then get to thinking about the original 4 treasures then of the Duatha de Danann, and it seemed to me that the spear of Lu fit so perfectly with spring equinox and the ash tree lore. It ties in with Odin and Jesus and other spear wounded rising light demigods, if you like, you know, and there seems to be the suggestion of all of this sacred sword lore to do with summer solstice, the realm of apples, you know. So then I got to thinking, well, you know, if spring equinox is spear of Lu, then is summer solstice sword of Nuada. You know, could that work out? And does that mean that the other two treasures relate to autumn equinox and winter solstice? You know, I don't know. It's just something I'm looking at. But when you're in the first Aicme, it's mainly about the cauldron of Anduin, and it concludes with the spear of Lu, if you like, and following, you know, directly opposite, if you like, is the broom, blackthorn, elder, triple goddess, and the cauldron of the other world, you know, and so that would fit very well with the cauldron of the Dagda being at autumn equinox. You know, the old Mercury, it's his time of year as well, that descent into the darkness and the aging. And then that leaves then the final treasure, the stone of destiny, relating to winter solstice. And what do you make of that? I don't know, but in the rock birth on Hadrian's Wall, the figure is rising out of a rock. It's a rock birth, you know, he's being born of a rock. And that star law around him is all winter solstice star law. You know, the most dense solidified matter is the Saturnalia. It's the darkest, densest lower chakra of your body, you know, and you're rising up from that. Or you could then think of it corresponding to the lower cauldron, the base of the lower cauldron, and the summer solstice, the sword. Well, it's the pineal gland, you know, drawing the sword from the stone. It's like drawing the energy up from the lower cauldron to the radiant brow. I know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head there. But, you know, it is fun, at least, to try and place the four treasures of the Uatha de Danann to the four directions, and you possibly could. And Apple, then, just to conclude, Apple does have all these sword correlations with summer solstice, or at least the realm of Apple's Avalon and the summer lands. And, you know, you could even go into the apple trees of the Garden of Hesperides and all of that sort of thing. Yeah, my brain's gone blank. So I'll stop recording and you can put your microphones back on.